All right, we are in our study on parenting, raising children God's way. We're ready for lesson 1 in the workbook. We'll get to that in just a moment, some preliminary things before we do that. As mentioned a moment ago, if you were coming in late, we have extra workbooks. If couples are sharing and you want separate workbooks, we should have enough. And so if you want to pick up a workbook, they're on the front row here when the lesson is through. See if we can get our slides to advance. Shannon, we're not advancing back there. We may have to close it out and restart that. That's what I understand has to be done. All right. This is our class schedule that we are in. We dealt with a preliminary study last time. And then from this point on, except for lesson 6, we're going to go through the workbook in sequence. And lesson 6 will take 2 lessons, and then after lesson 13, we'll add some additional information. We mentioned this book last time, and that it was not yet available online, but it is, part of it is already, where I'm scanning that chapter by chapter. And so if you want to know how to access that, it is a very helpful book. It is an extremely helpful book. It's out of print, unavailable. You may hunt around if you want to pay a little bit for one. You can hunt around and find one online somewhere. But if you'll go to our website, and this is our opening page, and look for Bible class schedule, and then from there you'll see 2 options. Go to the Sunday morning parenting class, which will bring up this page, and if you'll click there, you'll find the first 6 chapters, and the next several chapters are going to be added as time permits my scanning of that. So anyway, that's available to you. Hopefully you'll make use of that. That is some excellent material, and we will talk more about that book a little bit later and some things we learned from that. Last week we began listing some rules. These are applications of the principle of training a child in the way they should go. These are not in order in the sense that some of the rules may apply to when they're teenagers, some may apply to when they're grown, some may apply to when they're little bitty babies, and that we may not deal with those in sequence. So here's a rule that I think you'll find helpful, that was suggested to me a number of years ago by, and I forgot who, but don't give a child a choice you don't want them to make. Here's what we mean by that. For example, it may seem like a minor thing, but you tell the child, I'm going to take you out to eat today. Do you want to go to Cracker Barrel, which is what you're hoping they'll choose, or McDonald's? And when they say McDonald's, you react in a negative way. I thought you would say that. Oh boy. What did the child just learn from that? Their opinion don't matter. They make wrong choices. You gave them a choice, but then when they make a choice, they made the wrong one. That seems minor, but the child is learning from that when that's repeated over and over and over again. Or you say to the child, we can stay inside and play toys here, or we can go outside, and you're wanting one or the other, and when they make the choice, it's the wrong one, and you let them know, I thought you would do that. I was afraid you would decide that. Don't give your child a choice you don't want them to make, and then rebuke them or leave the impression they did the wrong thing in making the choice that you just gave them the option of making. That's a basic rule. We'll come back to that a little bit later. Here's another rule, number 4. Don't cater to a child's crying. You agree with that? %. Why do you say that? Absolutely. Now there is some comparison, and we will make some comparison, so don't get offended, between raising children and training animals. But if you have an inside dog and it barks while you're sitting at the table, and to hush the dog up, you say, I'll give it some food, what's going to happen the next meal? It's going to bark again. And he's learning, every time I bark, I get food, I'm going to keep barking. Same thing with a child. I cry, I throw a tantrum, and they come running. I want some attention. I throw a tantrum or I start crying. I cite a couple of things here. One is Proverbs 19:18. What does it say? King James, by the way, of that rendering. There is some discussion of translation there. Anybody have the King James of Proverbs 19:18? Nobody uses King James. Well, I'll find it then. Nobody's got a tablet that's got King James?
Chasten your son while there is hope. Do not set your heart on his destruction.
All right. Another translation. Maybe it wasn't King James. What am I thinking of? The New King James says, do not set your heart on his destruction. Yeah. Do not let your soul spare for his crying. What does that suggest to you? Chasten your son, discipline the child while there's hope, and do not let your soul spare for his crying. When I refuse to discipline the child because I don't want to hear their crying, I'm catering to their crying. When I decide not to be as severe because of their crying, I'm catering to their crying. Does that make sense? Now, when you get to, I don't know that this is it, what's been scanned yet. I'm not sure which chapter this was in. But on page 173, 172 and 173, it may not be up yet, but it will be soon. Take a look, especially if you have a real small child, page 173. She talks about how that when you rush in every time a child is crying, the child is going to keep crying, and talks about putting the child to bed, and the child cries. And if you let the child cry just a little while, in time, you'll get them to the point they'll quit that crying every time you put them to bed. Interesting point, page 172, 173. Agree with the principle? Don't cater to the crying? All right. We'll come back to those principles a little bit later. Let's move on. Let's talk about the need for godly parenting in an ungodly world. We'll say some preliminary things before we get to the workbook itself. I'm convinced that we have among brethren, and just forget the world, just among brethren, extreme attitudes when it comes to rearing children. The one extreme is there are those who act as if it's nothing. So here's a young couple that's found out they're about to have a child, and then they act and they talk like it's a piece of cake. There's nothing to rearing children. That's an extreme attitude. The other attitude is they act as if it's almost impossible to raise a child in an ungodly society in which we live. And neither of those extremes are true. We can avoid those extremes and still think it's extremely hard to raise kids. You'll hear older people sometimes say, it's so hard raising kids today. I'd hate to be raising my kids in today's world. I hear older people, particularly who now have grandkids, say, I sure wouldn't want to be raising kids in this environment. As if this is the worst the world has ever been. My grandmother used to say, the world is worse now than it's ever been. I didn't believe it when she said it. I don't believe it now. Can you think of worse times than these? Say again? Before the flood. How many righteous people were there? 8. I hope we've got more than 8 in this room. And these rooms are multiplied across the world. And so I don't think we're living quite in as bad a times as the days of Noah. Or the days of the judges, we'll get to in just a moment. I don't know that this is the worst it's ever been. But we have to admit that there are some challenges. Let's list some challenges here, and you may find a space somewhere in your workbook to write some of these challenges down. Here's some challenges to raising kids in an ungodly society. One is the culture that we live in. Now, without describing all that's going on in the culture, I just want to illustrate the impact of culture. Abraham and Sarah were influenced by culture. Without taking the time to develop fully, Genesis 12, God promised Abraham that he'd have children and that nations would be blessed through his seed. And he would have many descendants. At this point, he doesn't have any children. And so Abraham and Sarah took matters into their own hand, you'll remember, and blamed God. And then they developed their own plan that they would have a child by surrogate, by Hagar. Now, I'm not going to read all these quotations. Colin Daly suggests the resolution seemed a judicious one and according to the customs of the East. What I'm trying to illustrate to you is this was not a far-fetched concept in the environment in which Abraham and Sarah lived. They were influenced by the culture, is what I'm trying to drive at. That's how they devised the plan. Other evidence of that, this is from Rayburn and Fry, that suggests that Sarah's suggestion to her husband is in line with the family law of the Hurrians, another society in the region according at the time of Abram. Here is Murphy in Notes of the Old Testament. This complies with the customs of the country. The NET first edition notes said that this was the social custom of having a child through a surrogate. Just compounding a little evidence that they were heavily influenced by culture. So the culture in which we live, society in which we live, is a challenge for our kids. Here's another one. We only have a short window to do the work of raising our children. What do we mean by that? Absolutely. There's only so much time. And so if you ask some audiences and say, how much time do you have? Well, you have 18 years to, no, you don't have 18 years. Now, you may have 18 years there in your house, or if they stay a little longer, you may have 20-something years there in your household, and you are influencing them. I give you that. James Dobson's book I mentioned last time, and I won't read this quotation, basically what he's saying is a child's entire personality is formed by the age of 5. So you have a short window to get that under control. Does that make sense? In other words, are you still teaching and molding and shaping and instructing and correcting beyond age 5? Certainly you are, but basically their personality is shaped and formed by the age of 5, and so consequently you do have a very short window. That's a challenge. That's a very important challenge. Here's the third. Lack of respect for authority to parents, teachers, and that spills over into every realm of life. You agree with that? In other words, your children, if they are in public school, may associate with other children that have no respect for their parents' authority, the teacher's authority. It might be the same when they associate with fellow Christians whose children have a lack of respect, who haven't been taught respect. That could happen as well. What problems does that create? All right. Have you ever, those of you who've raised your children now, can you remember, or maybe you still have young children, but when you let your children spend time with other children, whether Christians or non-Christians or whatever the case, you let them spend time with other children, they come home and you've got to work a little bit out of them because they've got a little defiant attitude they learn from some other children. That's a challenge. All right, here's another challenge. Secular humanism is advanced all around us. I won't develop that thought, but starting in the school systems to cartoons, television programs, we're flooded with secular humanism that says man is his own God, everything evolved from a single cell, etc. And then peer pressure of friends, and we'll talk more about that a little later. All right, in the yellow circle or oval, there'll always be a page number if you're following in your workbook. And so if I fail to tell you where we are, just look on the screen. You should see a number up there, and that tells you what page we're on. So let's go to page 5 in the workbook. Let's give some introductory things, and then we'll go to our questions and start developing our points. Our author makes these points, and that is too many fathers and mothers are missing in action. What does he mean by that?
They're working, they're absent, they're not taking care of children for whatever reason or work.
All right. All right. They're not doing their job. They're missing in action in the sense that they're not either teaching or training, or they're busy doing other things, and so they're failing on the job. The author makes the point that failure in parenting could result in the ruin of the children, ruin of the family, ruin of the churches, and ruin of the nation. You agree with that? Why is our nation in the corrupt nature that it's in? In other words, I don't think any of us would look at our nation as a whole and say, this is really, really great. Why are we in the condition we're in? It goes back to the family and the home, and the rearing in the home and the family. All right? Why are some churches in the condition they're in? Why aren't there, we're talking on leadership on Wednesday night. Why is it that we have not enough elders across the land. I'm not saying in a particular church, but there are churches all across the land where maybe they're 300 in number and they only have 2 men qualified to be elders, or 3 men where there should have been 10. Why do we not have more men serving as elders? Broken homes. Failure to raise children. Maybe the home's not totally broken, but it may be that the children are turned out to the world. So the ruin of churches, ruin of nation, families are torn asunder because of that, and then children are left on a road to eternal hell. Make sense? So, the problems are complicated, the answers are simple. So let's go to page 5, and here in the first column, let's start developing these points. Let's go to question number 1 before we develop this. Our lesson is based upon Judges 13. Hopefully you've read through Judges 13 and then read through it again, at least, to get the setting and the story in the period of the Judges. So let's talk about question number 1. Describe the conditions of Israel when Samson was born, politically and then spiritually. What was going on? All right? Politically, they're being oppressed by the Philistines, perhaps even a bleed over of other oppression prior to this that's still going on. And now the Philistines for how many years? 40 years. What's going on spiritually? Worshiping Baal. People, according to verse 1 of Judges 13, are doing evil. In fact, Judges chapter 2 and in verse 10, after Joshua, there arose another generation after them that did not know God. Yeah. Now, you've heard me connect Judges 2:10 to Psalm 78. If you don't have a marginal note connection or a mental note connection, you might want to make that note. Judges 2:10 doesn't tell me why that was the case. Psalm 78 gives me the insight. What did we learn from Psalm 78? The statutes of the Lord were given that one generation may teach the next generation. The next generation didn't learn. So what's our conclusion? Most likely, they did not know God because the first generation or the one generation didn't teach the next. Does that make sense? The failure to instruct the next generation is part of what created the problem. All right, let's go to question number 2. Let's 3 evils in our world today that are challenges. We listed some of those. What are some challenges we face, like the days of the Judges? Entertainment. Atheism. Humanism. Social media. Peer pressure. Evolution. All right. All right, takes a village, doesn't it? At least some tell us.
In our society, that is totally acceptable for as long as your child is cared for by someone, then that's the same. It's equal. And it's not. Parents or those are supposed to take care of the child.
That's a good point. As long as someone is rearing and taking care of my child, it may be another family, may be somebody I've hired, then my job is fulfilled, and that's not the case. We'll come back to that a little bit later. Good point.
Also the giving up of, or the idea that it is the right of somebody else to take care of your child. And so parents are not always responsible, that it's others that are responsible.
All right, very good. Very good. All right, let's look at the points that are developed here by our author. And he raises the question, is it even possible to raise a godly family in an ungodly world? How would you answer that? All right. What else?
We have examples of people that did.
Yeah.
It's going to take a lot of work.
It takes work. It's a challenge. Say again? Doesn't happen by accident. That's a good point. It's not going to happen just all of a sudden out of the blue. It's going to take some purpose. I raised the question here, our author doesn't raise this one, but what would it take to change to make it possible? For the person who says, you know what, I think it's almost impossible to raise a child in this society, what would have to change for you to be able to raise a godly family? All right. David? Yeah. All right. That's true. I guess what I'm driving at in that question is if I can't raise a family in this society, if I can't be godly and raise a godly family in this society, what has to change? Well, society has to improve. Then you never will be able to. If that's the concept we're driving at, if that has to be the case, then you never will. Nobody can have a godly family. So it's just over, done, and finished. Nobody can be godly. Our author develops this thought: corruption in the world is nothing new. What did we learn from Ecclesiastes? We saw it over and over again. There's nothing new under the sun. So we're not living in new times. This is not, we think this is the worst it's ever been, or we're dealing with a new challenge. No, we're not. No, we're not. This is the same challenge Noah dealt with. In fact, we've already mentioned Noah. Noah raised his family in an ungodly world. In the days of the judges, they didn't know God. And yet here is a case that we're going to be studying, in the case of raising of Samson, that you can still raise a family in the midst of an ungodly society. That's the point we're driving at. If it could be done in the days of Noah, if God expected it then and expects it now, then it can be done. Now, our author doesn't develop this as a full point, but he does hint at Samson's parents raised him in an ungodly world. The nation sinned, verse 1, Judges 13. And that resulted in the oppression for 40 years. And in the midst of that, it can be done. Notice at the bottom of that section, he mentions Philippians 4:13. How does Philippians 4:13 relate to this? I can do anything God expects me to do, whatever that is. And so if God says, raise your child and teach the child in the way that he should go, I can do whatever God expects me to do. May be challenging, may be difficult. I may have to go through some hurdles, but that can be done. All right. Still on page 5 is where we start, and then we go over immediately to page 6. Here's the second major point. So godly parents can be faithful in an unfaithful world. Godly parents listen to God in a spiritually deaf world. Do you agree with that? All right, let's see what this is about. Manoah, who's Manoah? Samson's dad. Manoah prayed. Let's go to chapter 8 and chapter 13 and in verse 8. You remember the story. If you haven't read it, the story was that Manoah and his wife is not named, but Manoah's wife, which would be Samson's mother, she is barren, doesn't have a child. An angel appears to her and tells her she's going to have a child, and tells her he's going to be a Nazirite. In other words, he's going to be separated to the Lord and in the service of the Lord. And so here's some requirements you've got to go through. She runs and tells him, that is Manoah, and so now we're at verse 8, that he prayed to God, and what did he pray? Yeah, come again to us and teach us what we shall do for the child that shall be born. All right? So here's the first thing to learn about parenting. Pray. This was before the child was even born. So let's stop and talk about what parents should pray for just briefly, and then we want to move on to some other things. Obviously, we should thank God for the child. I'm not going to spend time there because we did that last week. Let's talk about wisdom. Parents ought to pray for wisdom. What would that include? Say again? All right, how to guide the child. Many of the calls that you're going to make as a parent is not always a right versus wrong. In other words, it's not hard to decide lying is not acceptable. We have to tell the truth in our family. That's not hard. Stealing is not acceptable in our household. That's not hard to figure that out. That doesn't take a lot of wisdom. But a lot of decisions you make as a parent involves wisdom. For example, when is it time for them to learn this principle? Or should I wait just a little bit? Or is this too early for me to be teaching them this principle? That takes wisdom. When do I do things for them and when do I make them do things for themselves? When do I add more responsibility, or is that too much responsibility to be giving them? When do I spank and when do I not spank? Not every offense deserves a severe spanking. Some do. How do you make that call? That takes some wisdom. When do I command and condemn, and when do I console and comfort? When our children were born, even before they were born, I prayed every day that God would give me the wisdom. Let me know when I should spank and when I shouldn't, and when I should console and comfort, and when I should command and condemn, and when I do things for them and when I make them do things for themselves, and on down through the list I just mentioned. That makes sense? Pray for wisdom. God, help me to see. And your wisdom may come in a fashion that you may not recognize that that's the answer to God's prayer. It may be a lesson here. It may be someone giving you advice, or it may be someone's example set before you. That may be God's answer to your plea for wisdom. Pray for the child's health. Ask God to bless them as Joseph did, or Jacob did, and pray for the child's obedience, as you see in 1 Samuel, 1 Chronicles rather, 29, David praying for Solomon's obedience. Make sense? All right, let's go further. Manoah asked for God's help. What's he asking for? Back to verse 8. Manoah said, teach us what we shall do with the child who will be born. For guidance. For guidance. Notice his parental work began before the child was born. Help us to know when this child comes, what's going on. Point number 2 is an important point, I think. Many wait too late before they begin to ask that question. On more than one occasion, I've had some parent who is shedding tears call me to come and talk to them and tell me what I can do to salvage my child. And here's the child in high school or beyond. They're involved in drugs, they're involved in drinking, they're involved in various things. They're not going to church like they should, et cetera, et cetera. What can I do? And I hate to tell them, but my blunt answer is, I'm sorry, but it is too late to be asking that. You should have asked this question 20 years ago. You're asking that too late. I'm sorry. It's just too late. Don't be the parent that you go to the preacher or the elders and you're crying because it's too late. Make sense? Be a Manoah who said before the child's born, I need to know what I'm doing with this child. Help me to see. Now, where am I going to find that help? From the scriptures. That's part of what this study is about. Where else can I find that? 2 Timothy 3. But where else might I find some of this help? Say again? Mentors, yes. Look to those who've done well. Look to those who've done well. Let me illustrate. If you were suddenly given $1 million, and your child's worth more than $1 million, I suppose you feel that way. If you were suddenly given $1 million and you wanted to know what to do with it since you've not handled $1 million before, where would you turn?
Somebody that's made $1 million.
What about the person who never had $1 million at all? Why, that's good advice. They'll know, won't they? Why?
Because they
Never had it. All right. But I've got a friend who had $2 or $3 million and lost all of it. That'll be the best place for advice. Why you say no?
go to the man that's had to work for that million, that's made the mistakes to get there and successful handling it.
Why not do that with children? In other words, rather than turn to the world or to somebody that's never raised children or somebody that's raised children and they didn't turn out well, look to the person or people who've raised their children, done well, and seek their advice. And often, they're the ones that are not as free with their advice as those who've not done as well. When our children were real small, the people who came running to us offering advice how to handle the children were the ones whose children had turned out to the world. And I've never understood that. Never understood that. I don't get it. I don't get it. Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. Absolutely. Notice at the bottom of page, what is that, 6. Manoah submitted to God's will without question. Look at verse 12. Now your words come to pass. Now let your words come to pass. That's the phrase we want to look at. Let your words come to pass. In other words, Manoah accepted the instructions and basically said to God, your will be done. Your will be done. And so we don't have time to develop fully, but we ought to take that with any passage and say to the Lord, your will be done. You gave the instructions, raise your child in the way that he should go, Proverbs 22, your will be done. Teach and train him in the admonition of the Lord, your will be done. Discipline the child, your will be done. Teach them the fear of God, Deuteronomy 4, your will be done. Make sense? And I think of Proverbs 22:15, foolishness bound in the heart of the child, and the rod will drive it far from him. We're thinking maybe that doesn't work. Your will be done. Let's follow your will. Make sense? All right. Let's go to the third point now, and that is godly parents plan for the eternal in a temporal world. And we're on page 6 now, where this one starts. And so let's look at verse 12. Manoah planned for the child's rule of life. 2 things here, his rule of life and his work. So what does it mean he planned for the rule of his life? Look at verse 12. What will be the boy's rule of life? What will be your child's rule of life? In other words, what's going to be what they do in life? What's going to be what controls their life? What's going to be what captivates their attention throughout life? What is it? For some, it's sports. Others, it's music, movies, worldly companions. Manoah said, "What? You tell me, God. I want you to tell me what his rule of life will be." Does that make sense? What do you learn from Abraham? Our author cites Genesis 18:19. What do you learn from Abraham?
Well, he kept the way of the Lord, so if your child is born keeping God's way, you're going to teach them the things that God would have him do, and not so concerned about what you can become in the world as a sports person or whatever, but you're more concerned about God than you.
All right, very good. Look at Proverbs chapter 4. Our author makes this point. Will your child be able to say what's found here in this text? In other words, here's the point, that when I was, look at verse 3, when I was my father's son, tender and the only one inside of my mother, he taught me and said to me, let your heart retain my words, keep the commands and live, and go get wisdom and understanding. And on down he describes wisdom being the principal theme. Will your children remember that you gave emphasis to their rule of life, to wisdom being the principal thing? Will they look back and say, you know, I remember mom and dad telling me about the principles of wisdom and following God's word, or I don't ever remember any of that. What was the second question that Manoah asked? Tell me his rule of life. Tell me the child's work. It's hard, isn't it? Tell me the child's work. What is that about? What he's going to be. Yeah. What's he going to do? What is his primary role in life? What's he going to be doing? Very much, our author kind of separates those, and I'm good with that, as if they were two questions. Really, it's the same question at verse 12. In other words, let's talk about the child's work. Let's talk about physical work, their occupation, which is probably not what that's actually talking about, though it would be included. Children have to be taught work. They need to be taught responsibility. We're living in a time, this is not new to our time. It's been true all through time, but perhaps worse a little bit now. It's hard to find people who are willing to work because, one reason, they're not taught to work. They haven't been taught responsibility. Children need to learn a strong work ethic. Would you agree with that? Why?
Well, the thing is, if they're given everything and they're never have to work to get something, they always think something's going to be given. They're not going to learn to work.
Never learn the principle. I'm going to skip Proverbs 29, Ecclesiastes 9. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might. Teach them to be hard workers. If you're taking notes, you might write out to the side of your margin on your workbook there on page 6, Colossians 3:23. And that is, whatever you do, do it heartily as to the Lord. The Christian ought to be the best worker. Your child ought to be the best worker at wherever they end up working. They ought to be the hardest worker. And if they're not, you need to raise the question, why aren't they? What have I taught them? What have I failed to teach them? Proverbs 6 talks about, go to the ant, you sluggard. Watch how the ant works. All through Proverbs, there's the warning about being slothful. But that applies to spiritual work. They need to be spiritual in their work. So there's emphasis on the eternal in the midst of a temporal world. Let's talk about point number 4. Godly parents are to be obedient in a disobedient world. We're on page 7. Page 7. Manoah and his wife had to be careful. What's that about? Verse 13. The angel told Manoah the same thing he told his wife. Let her be careful. He's talking about the Nazirite vow, is what he's talking about. So in order for him to be the Nazirite, you don't drink anything. You be careful. You don't take a drink of anything, of wine, et cetera, et cetera. And then when he's born, this is what's to take place. You make sure you go through the details of these requirements. Here's what I'm learning from that. A child can't be left to himself. That principle applies to each and every one of us. Our children are to be set aside, not as a Nazirite vow, but we're setting them apart to the service of the Lord. Are we not? Just as important as the Nazirite vow. And so, consequently, we need to be careful. Don't raise the child assuming that all is going to work out just fine. Would you agree with that statement?
I think that leads back to last week's study. We talked about before your child ever comes, like have an idea of have the goal in mind that I'm raising this child, and in the end, I have an adult who loves God. Have that goal in mind. I think that's what Manoah is doing. He's like, what's going to be his purpose? Is he going to be a prophet? Is he going to be a leader? Is he going to,
Yeah.
What are my goals here? And
Absolutely.
I think that's where we need to start, is our goal needs to be, in the end, our child is faithful to God. Doesn't matter about anything else, but faithful to God.
All right. Very good. Yeah, I think I see a number of parents who just assume everything's going to be fine. We go to church most of the time, and I don't have to really work with my children, and everything's going to work out fine. And most of the time, it does not, if that's the attitude. Manoah and his wife had to be obedient. We've already talked about the Nazirite vow, what was involved in that, and they were told to be careful. Our author makes this point, and I think this is a very powerful point on page 7. Rather than wanting your child to fit in, we should want them to stand out. What does that mean?
Proud in their thoughts and their habits and their practices and their priorities, but you want them to stand out with God's habits and thoughts and priorities.
Absolutely, absolutely. We put too much emphasis on, I want my child to fit in and have friends, and I don't want them, I want them to be a part of the school's scene. I want them to be involved with their friends, and And yet, we should want our children to stand out and be different. Come out from among them and be ye separate, 2 Corinthians 6. Make sense? When you see your child is different from the rest of the world, perhaps you've done the job you need to do. Finally, our time is gone, page 7. We need to be grateful. And what we learn here is Manoah thanked God for his children by offering the sacrifice, and rather than being a burden, and consequently the child was blessed. So what we're learning from this story, or this lesson, is in the case of raising Samson, is that you can raise a child in the midst of an ungodly world. Page 8, the question is raised, what kind of parent will you be? That's a good question, isn't it? Going to be like Manoah? Or what are we going to be? Time is gone. Lesson 2 next time.